who exactly was the fashion doctor? The man who skirted the Nazi elite to gain intimate control of Adolf Hitler's veins? This figure, operating in the shadow of the Third Reich's most infamous personalities, was not a general, a strategist, or a high-ranking party official. He was a physician, but of a most peculiar and controversial kind. His story is a chilling exploration of how medical power, personal access, and unchecked ambition can converge. He navigated the treacherous currents of the Führer's inner circle, not with political savvy, but with a syringe eventually becoming the single indispensable man who biologically sustained the architect of the Holocaust, holding his very consciousness and vitality in his hands. Meet Theodor Morell. Long before he was in the Führer's bunker, he was a well-known, if controversial, figure in Berlin. He was a successful and wealthy general practitioner. His practice was not in a gritty, working-class neighborhood. It was located on the prestigious Kurfürstendamm, the epicenter of Berlin's high society. His clients were not the common man, but the elite, actors, industrialists, politicians, and the wealthy socialites who defined the city's glamorous pre-war scene. He had the reputation of a man who could get results, even if his methods were different. He built his professional reputation and his considerable wealth on a foundation of unconventional, almost exotic treatments. Morell was a pioneer of what might today be called alternative medicine. Setting him apart from the staid, rigid, and traditional German medical establishment, he didn't just prescribe aspirin and bed rest. He prescribed strange, proprietary concoctions of high-dose vitamins, injected revitalizing hormones, and, most notably, championed the use of live bacteria, probiotics, which he believed were the key to holistic health. This veneer of cutting-edge, pseudoscientific novelty made him incredibly popular with his wealthy, thrill-seeking clientele. A simple, chronic, and deeply embarrassing stomachache would, in a bizarre twist of fate, change the course of the war. This was not a grand political decision, a battlefield miscalculation, or a diplomatic failure. It was a private biological malady, a persistent, agonizing cramping deep inside the Führer's gut. The fact that a decision of such geopolitical magnitude, placing a quack at the very center of power, would hinge on such a mundane human ailment is one of history's darkest and most absurd ironies. The entire world would eventually be affected by a doctor's appointment made to cure a case of indigestion. For years, Adolf Hitler, the man who projected an image of ascetic, disciplined, superhuman strength, was a physical wreck in private. He suffered from debilitating chronic stomach cramps that could leave him doubled over in pain, as well as unpredictable, explosive flatulence that humiliated him. This was compounded by a severe oozing eczema that covered parts of his body. He was desperate. Germany's top medical minds, the most acclaimed and traditional professors of medicine, were summoned. They all failed to cure him, offering only bland diets and ineffective salves. Their failure created a vacuum of desperation, one that only an unconventional genius could fill. The connection was made not through official channels, but through the intimacy of the inner circle. Hitler's personal photographer and old friend, Heinrich Hoffmann, was a patient of Morell's and swore by his results. Hoffmann, who had intimate, non-political access to the Führer, listened to Hitler's constant complaints about his health. Finally, he made the fateful recommendation, suggesting that Hitler see his own unconventional doctor, a man who had worked wonders for him. Hitler, with nothing to lose and frustrated by the failures of experts, agreed to see him. Dr. Morell, upon examining the Führer in 1936, acted with decisive, confident speed. He diagnosed Hitler's intestinal issues as a dysbiosis of the gut flora. He immediately administered one of his own proprietary bacterial preparations, a probiotic pill called Mutiflora, made from a specific strain of E. coli bacteria. The result was, in Hitler's mind, nothing short of miraculous. Within a short time, the chronic stomach cramps and the agonizing gas that had plagued him for years vanished. Hitler was not just relieved. He was, in his own word, cured. How did this man, a physician widely dismissed by the rest of the Nazi elite as a quack, an opportunistic charlatan, and a greasy, unkempt social climber, become the Führer's shadow? The answer lies in that first miracle. By solving a problem that the best doctors in Germany could not. Morell proved his value to Hitler in the most personal, visceral way imaginable. From that moment on, his proximity was guaranteed. He was no longer just a doctor. He was the only doctor, the man who held the keys to Hitler's physical well-being, and he would follow his patient, everywhere, becoming a permanent, indispensable, and dark fixture in the Führer's life. Hitler, a man of extreme, immediate, and often misplaced judgments, was overjoyed. His gratitude was boundless. He didn't just thank Morell, embraced him as a savior. He declared to his astonished inner circle that Morell was a medical genius, a man who had succeeded where all the supposedly superior, academic-minded physicians had failed. For Hitler, this was proof of his own instinctive genius for finding the right man. His relief from years of chronic pain and digestive humiliation was so profound that it forged an immediate, unshakable bond of loyalty. The reward was immediate and absolute. Theodor Morell was instantly appointed as Hitler's personal full-time physician. This was not a part-time consultancy. This was a 24/7 on-call position that required Morell to travel with Hitler everywhere. From the Berghof in the mountains to the Wolf's Lair on the front lines, the role came with immense, almost unimaginable power and access. Morell was now one of a handful of people who saw the Führer every single day in his most private and vulnerable moments, in his pajamas, during his medical examinations, and in his moments of physical distress. The rest of the Nazi leadership, the old fighters and high-ranking officials like Hermann Göring, Albert Speer, and Heinrich Himmler, were utterly disgusted. They saw Morell as a clumsy, obese, an opportunistic charlatan who smelled bad and had no place in their revolutionary circle. They openly mocked him. Göring, with his typical bombastic flair, gave Morell the derogatory nickname Der Reich Spritzenmeister, the Reich injection master. Albert Speer, the sophisticated architect, simply dismissed him as a quack, and Himmler, obsessed with his own pseudo-medical theories, viewed him as a dangerous rival. But all the mockery, all the whispers and insults from the most powerful men in the Reich meant nothing. Hitler's faith was absolute and non-negotiable. He had found the man who cured him, and he would not be swayed by the jealousy or snobbery of his lieutenants. When they complained about Morell, Hitler would angrily defend him, retorting that he didn't pay Morell to smell good, he paid him to keep him healthy. This unshakable, personal loyalty from the Führer made Morell untouchable. He was always at Hitler's side, a constant syringe-wielding presence that the rest of the court was forced to tolerate. This new, protected relationship established a ritual that would define the rest of Hitler's life. The Führer of the Third Reich, the man responsible for the lives of millions and the strategic command of a world war. He began every single day, not with his generals or with strategic maps, but with a needle. The first appointment of the day, the prerequisite for all other work, was his session with Dr. Morell. The day's decisions, the fate of armies, and the governance of the Reich all had to wait until after his morning treatment. The routine, as meticulously documented in Morell's own journals, began with a daily injection of a substance he called Vitamoltin. This was another of Morell's proprietary, high-sounding preparations, a cocktail that he administered to Hitler as a general revitalizer and tonic. This ritual was not occasional. It was a non-negotiable daily occurrence. It became the cornerstone of Hitler's medical regimen, the first in a long and escalating series of chemical interventions that Morell would use to manage his high-strung high stakes. Patient A, what was in this Vitamoltin? It was not, at this early stage, a hard narcotic. It was rather a high-dose, intravenous cocktail of various vitamins, particularly B and C, mixed with a solution of glucose or simple sugar. This combination was, in effect, a biological quick fix. The massive, immediate infusion of glucose would provide an instant, artificial burst of energy, a sugar rush straight to the vein. The vitamins, meanwhile, provided the psychological assurance of health, making Hitler feel that he was being fortified against the immense stresses of his position. The effect of this glucose and vitamin injection was immediate. For a hypochondriac like Hitler, it was profoundly addictive on a psychological level. He felt instantly revived. The fatigue, the stress, the grogginess of the morning, all would melt away in the warm, energetic rush of Morell's needle. This instant, tangible result was what cemented his dependency. He began to associate feeling good with Morell's injections. He quickly reached a point where he felt he couldn't start his day or face a difficult meeting without the artificial cure that only his medical genius could provide. But what happens in any system of chemical dependency? What happens when the initial dose no longer provides the same transcendent rush? What happens when the stresses of running a failing global war demand a greater and greater revival? What happens, quite simply, when vitamins are no longer enough? The body builds a tolerance. The baseline level of normal shifts. The patient begins to demand more, and the doctor, whose entire career is now tied to the patient's satisfaction, is pressured to escalate the treatment to the next, more potent level. As the war turned against Germany and the immense, crushing stress of defeat began to mount, Hitler's physical and mental health wavered. He was sleeping less, consumed by rages, and physically exhausted. Morell, seeing his vitamin cocktails failing to produce the same miraculous results, did not change course. He simply escalated. He began to inject Hitler with a new, more potent, and far more dangerous class of substances: potent animal hormones derived from the glands of livestock.
Ow.
This was a move from health tonics to something far more radical. These new rejuvenation concoctions were a bizarre and disturbing mix. Straight from the annals of quasi-scientific quackery, Morell's logs detail injections containing testosterone to boost the Führer's flagging energy and aggression. More grotesquely, they also included crude live cell extracts from the prostates of young bulls and the seminal vesicles of other animals. He was, in effect, injecting Hitler with pulverized, raw glandular secretions. Believing he could transfer the vigor of a young bull directly into the veins of the 50-something dictator, the hormonal escalation didn't stop with animal glands. In his relentless quest to maintain Hitler's artificial vigor and mask the natural decline caused by stress, lack of sleep, and a terrible diet, Morell began administering early forms of anabolic steroids. These were powerful, body-altering drugs. This was no longer medicine. This was performance enhancement. A desperate attempt to chemically manufacture the Superman image that Hitler's own propaganda demanded. In his pursuit of this goal, Morell was pushing all known medical and ethical boundaries, experimenting on his one patient with terrifying recklessness. This recklessness is perhaps best explained by a massive, unethical conflict of interest. Theodor Morell wasn't just a doctor dutifully serving his patient. He was simultaneously a savvy and greedy pharmaceutical entrepreneur. He owned significant shares in several companies that manufactured the very patented products he was prescribing. He wasn't just treating Hitler. He was using Hitler to build his own business empire, securing his own financial future with every injection he gave. The Führer of the Third Reich, the most powerful and protected man in Europe, had effectively become a human guinea pig. Morell used Hitler as a test subject for his own patented products, many of which were unproven, unstable, and produced in his own questionable factories. If a substance worked on Hitler, or more accurately, if Hitler believed it worked, Morell could then market that substance, using his connection to the Führer as the ultimate, if secret, endorsement. It was a closed loop of profit, experimentation, and medical malpractice. Drugs like Mutaflur, the same live bacteria in a pill that had first cured Hitler's stomach, were not a one-time fix. They were administered constantly, becoming part of a daily barrage of treatments. This was polypharmacy taken to its most insane extreme. Hitler was not just getting injections, he was swallowing, by Morell's own account, dozens of other pills, tonics, and drops every single day. He was a walking receptacle for Morell's entire product line. In this bizarre, codependent relationship, the line between legitimate medical treatment and dangerous, profit-motivated medical quackery was not just blurred, it was completely erased. Morell's own journals, when analyzed after the war, showed that he was prescribing over 70 different substances to Hitler, often in bizarre and chemically contradictory combinations. He was giving him uppers, downers, vitamins, hormones, bacteria, and crude animal extracts, all at the same time, with no regard for the long-term catastrophic interactions. How was this entire reckless enterprise kept secret from the world, and even from the prying eyes of the Nazi inner circle? What was the secret code that protected Hitler's image as an infallible, healthy leader and shielded Morell's dangerous, escalating addiction? The code was simple, mundane, and chillingly bureaucratic. Patient A. This was the term that protected everything. How was this entire reckless enterprise kept secret from the world and even from the prying eyes of the Nazi inner circle. What was the secret code that protected Hitler's image as an infallible, healthy leader and shielded Morell's dangerous, escalating addiction? The code was simple, mundane, and chillingly bureaucratic. Patient A, this was the term that protected everything. In Theodor Morell's incredibly detailed, almost obsessive medical logs, the name Adolf Hitler never appears. He is only and always referred to as Patient A. This secrecy was total. It was a necessary fiction. For Hitler, it protected his public image of superhuman strength. For Morell, it protected his medical malpractice from any outside scrutiny. These journals, which detailed every pill, every drop, and every single injection, were a private record of the slow motion, chemical destruction of the most powerful man in the world. Over the years, their toxic relationship became perfectly, horrifyingly symbiotic. Each man needed the other for his own survival. Hitler, by this point, was a full-blown addict, both psychologically and physically. He needed Morell, his personal enabler, to provide the daily fix, the chemical cocktail that would get him out of bed, calm his stomach, energize him for his marathon-long monologues, and allow him to simply function. He was a dictator entirely dependent on his dealer. And Morell, in turn, needed Hitler just as desperately. Morell was a man surrounded by enemies. The Nazi elite, from Gring to Speer to Himmler and Bormann, despised him. They saw him as a quack, a fraud, and a parasite, and they were constantly plotting to have him removed. Morell knew that the only thing standing between him and a concentration camp, or worse, was Hitler's personal protection. He needed Hitler for the immense power, the staggering wealth, and the absolute protection he enjoyed as the Führer's medical genius. The relationship escalated from dependency to acute survival at a specific violent moment. This was the turning point. This was the moment Hitler's very survival, his ability to function minute to minute, depended not on his SS guards, not on his generals, and not on his soldiers, but on the contents of Theodor Morell's syringe. The entire fate of the war at this point became tied to a needle. The date was July 20th, 1944, at the Wolfslayer military headquarters in East Prussia. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase bomb under the conference table, just feet from where Hitler was standing. The bomb exploded with catastrophic force, obliterating the room and killing several officers. Hitler, shielded by the heavy oak table, survived, but he was not uninjured. He was severely wounded, deafened, and in profound, agonizing shock. The blast had been devastating. Both of Hitler's eardrums were burst. His legs were burned. His entire body, and particularly his back, was riddled with over 100 long, sharp wooden splinters from the shattered table. He was in a state of acute, screaming, agonizing pain. The miracle of his survival was immediately overshadowed by the trauma of his injuries. The shock and the pain were so severe that he was completely incapacitated. Into this crisis stepped Theodor Morell. The vitamins, the hormones, the glucose, these were all useless now. This was not a case of fatigue. This was a case of acute, 10 out of 10, agonizing pain. Morell knew he had to cure this pain immediately, or his own position would be in jeopardy. He reached into his medical bag and introduced a new, powerful, and fateful painkiller into Hitler's regimen, Eucodal. This was not a simple drug. This was not aspirin. Eucodal was, and is, a potent opiate. A powerful synthetic heroin derivative that was first synthesized in Germany in 1917, it produced a massive wave of euphoria and was, in fact, twice as strong as morphine. It is one of the most addictive substances on the planet. Today, we know this drug by its modern, infamous name, oxycodone. From this day forward, Hitler was, for all intents and purposes, a functional heroin addict. What does a dictator lead a war? A global two-front, failing war while high on a daily cocktail of heroin, meth, and cocaine. This is the unbelievable, yet historically accurate reality of the Third Reich's final agonizing year. The man making the decisions was not sober. The supreme commander of the Wehrmacht was, by this point, one of the most heavily drugged men in Europe, a polyaddict whose reality was being chemically engineered day by day by his personal physician. Morell, in his quest to manage patient A, created the infamous speedball cocktail. The problem was the pain. To treat Hitler's agonizing injuries from the bomb blast, He administered heavy and frequent doses of Eucodol oxycodone, an opiate downer. This successfully killed the pain, but it also plunged Hitler into a narcotic stupor, a semi-comatose state that rendered him incapable of giving orders or even holding a conversation. But a comatose Führer was useless to Morell and to Germany. So, to counteract the opiate stupor, he was forced to simultaneously administer powerful uppers. This is the classic destructive cycle of the speedball, an opiate mixed with a stimulant. To wake Hitler up from his opiate fog, Morell had to balance the chemical equation, creating a walking, talking, chemically animated version of a leader. This upper cocktail was just as extreme. It included, according to Morell's logs, cocaine, which was administered as cocaine-laced eye drops, supposedly to treat the pain in his eyes, but which would be absorbed systemically. More importantly, it included Pervitin pure, unadulterated methamphetamine. This was the same Panzer chocolate used to keep tank crews awake for days. Morell was injecting Hitler with meth to keep him functional, awake, and artificially euphoric, all while the opiates kept his physical pain at bay. The savior who had cured Hitler's stomachache in 1936 had now, by 1944, become his destroyer. The visible physical toll of this extreme, contradictory drug abuse was horrifying to Hitler's inner circle, who watched their Führer disintegrate before their very eyes. The man who had been a vegetarian, a teetotaler, the image of pure Aryan health, was now a shambling, shaking, chemical-laced wreck. Years of this relentless daily doping left Hitler a complete physical ruin. His most famous ailment in the final years, the severe, uncontrollable tremors in his left hand, often attributed to Parkinson's disease, was likely exacerbated and dramatically worsened by the constant long-term drug abuse. The contradictory signals of opiate downers and methamphetamine uppers ravaged his central nervous system, creating a feedback loop of shaking, agitation, and physical decay. The other physical signs were just as damning. His skin turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow, a likely sign of liver failure from processing the sheer volume of chemicals. His teeth, by all accounts, rotted in his gums. And most chillingly, his arms became scarred messes of suppurating infected track marks. After thousands of injections, Morell had difficulty finding a clean, usable vein. Hitler's body was quite literally collapsing. This leads to one of history's most terrifying and unanswerable questions. Were Hitler's final insane suicidal orders his own? Or were they the deluded paranoid ramblings of the drugs? As the Reich collapsed, his orders became more and more detached from reality, culminating in the Nero Decree in order to destroy all of Germany's own infrastructure. Was this nihilistic ideology, or was it a drug-fueled psychosis? Historians and medical experts fiercely debate this very question. How much exactly did this severe drug dependency influence his catastrophic military decisions? Some argue that Hitler was an ideologue first, and the drugs merely gave him the artificial energy to pursue his already insane objectives. Others argue the opposite, that the drugs, the meth-fueled euphoria, the opiate-induced detachment, were a primary cause of his detachment from reality, making him incapable of rational thought. The evidence for the drug's influence is compelling. His known psychological state in the final year, his erratic, uncontrollable rages, his moments of bizarre, unfounded euphoria believing in miracle weapons, and his intense paranoid delusions that his generals were all betraying him, align perfectly with the textbook psychological side effects of chronic high-dose opiate and methamphetamine abuse. He was, in many ways, a textbook addict. The Battle of the Bulge, his final, desperate, and militarily insane offensive in the winter of 1944, is a prime example. It was a massive, suicidal gamble launched by a man who was, by all accounts, completely detached from the reality of his situation. This was a decision made by a man high on his own supply, fed a chemical-laced fantasy of victory by his Reich injection master, while his armies and his body fell apart. In the end, as with all such stories, the drugs ran out. The vast pharmaceutical and industrial machine of the Third Reich, which had supplied Morell with his endless vials and pills, had been bombed into oblivion. The supply chain that fed Hitler's addiction finally and catastrophically collapsed, just as the Red Army reached the gates of Berlin. The setting was April 1945, in the final claustrophobic days in the Vorbunker in Berlin. Allied bombing raids had pulverized the city and, crucially, destroyed the last of Theodor Morell's medical supplies. The Eucadol was gone. The Pervitin was gone. The cocaine was gone. Suddenly, and for the first time in years, Hitler was forced to go cold turkey. He was now in the middle of the final battle, in a state of severe, agonizing withdrawal. In a final, profound, and tragic comic irony. Hitler now shaking violently. Not just from his Parkinson-esque, but from opiate withdrawal lashed out at the one man he had protected for a decade. On April 21, 1945, just days before his own suicide, Hitler summoned Morell and dismissed him in a final, paranoid rage. He screamed at his doctor, accusing him of trying to poison him with his injections. The man who had been poisoning him all along was, in the end, accused of it. Precisely at the moment the poison was withdrawn. But what happened to the man who held Hitler's life in his syringe? What was the fate of Theodor Morell, the Reich injection master, after his screaming? Terrified patient A finally dismissed him. He fled the bunker, a man with more secrets than perhaps any other, only to fall into the hands of the victors. Theodor Morell was captured by the Americans shortly after the war's end. He was apprehended at a hospital in Bad Reichenhall, and the Allies, who had been hunting the entire Nazi hierarchy, were fascinated by this strange, obese man who claimed to have been Hitler's personal physician. They began a series of intense interrogations, trying to understand the inner workings of Hitler's court. The Allied interrogators, many of whom were medical professionals themselves, were shocked, horrified, and clinically disgusted when they found and translated Morell's meticulous, self-incriminating journals. They could not believe what they were reading. The logs, detailing every single injection given to patient A, were a perfect, day-by-day record of what they viewed as systemic, catastrophic malpractice, if not outright criminal behavior. Morell's defense, when confronted with his own journals and the accusations of the Allies, was chillingly simple, consistent, and evasive. I was just his doctor. He presented himself as a simple physician, a man who had done his best to treat a difficult patient under stressful circumstances. He attempted to normalize his radical treatments as the actions of a dedicated, if misunderstood, medical professional. He insisted, until the very end, that he was a legitimate physician, and a medical pioneer, not a dope fiend's enabler, as the American interrogators accused him. He claimed he was not a quack. His primary defense was to shift all agency and all blame to his patient. He claimed he only did what Hitler demanded, that Hitler was a difficult patient who would have sought the drugs elsewhere, and that he was merely trying to manage the Führer's health as best he could. The Allied conclusion, after months of interrogation, was nuanced. They did not believe Morell was a calculating, malicious killer, or a secret agent actively trying to poison Hitler as some had theorized. They concluded that he was, at his core, a pathetic figure, a sycophant, an opportunist, a man of mediocre talent who was blinded by ambition. He was a man who, when given access to absolute power, was too weak, too greedy, and too incompetent to do anything but say yes. This leads to the final puzzling question. Why was history's most notorious medical enabler, a man whose own journals provided a roadmap of drug abuse and malpractice, never charged with a crime? He was not put in the dock at Nuremberg alongside the generals and the politicians, was in the end simply let go. Theodor Morell was never formally tried for war crimes or any other crime. The Allies, it seemed, couldn't find a specific statute he had violated. Was it a war crime to be a bad doctor to a bad man? He was held in an American internment camp for 2 years, where his own health collapsed. He was released in June 1947, morbidly obese, broken, and in failing health. He died just 1 year later, in May 1948, in the small German town of Tegernsee. He died in total obscurity, a forgotten, penniless man. His death went almost completely unnoticed by a world that was busy rebuilding itself. The Reich injection master, the man who had been at the very center of power, simply faded away. The final verdict of history, then, is not on a killer, but on an enabler. Theodor Morell was a man whose profound incompetence and ambition, a lethal combination, made him the perfect tool. He was the man who, through his weakness, his greed, and his desperate need for validation, became the facilitator, the enabler, and the biological sustainer for history's greatest monster. He didn't create the monster, but he was the one who kept it fed, awake, and functional long after it should have collapsed.